2 weeks ago when we had the pre-construction meeting or the kickoff meeting was, well, so now if there's lights in the meeting, are the trees gonna go? And we said we haven't figured out exactly what the spacing is gonna be.
Can everyone hear us up here clearly? Great. I'm going to go ahead and call this September 18th, 2017 meeting of the Whitefish City Council to order. I would like to thank Officer Veneman for being here this evening and ask that he lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance tonight. Please extend all the officers and law enforcement personnel you work with on behalf of the council and the city. Thanks very much for all your efforts over the past week. It's very much appreciated. Thank you very much. On that note, our city manager, Adam Hammond, is attending the public open house over at the Performing Arts Center, which started at 7 p.m. to provide the public a general update on what's happening with the recent school threats. We want to send our best as well to all of the teachers, students, and families in our neighboring community of Columbia Falls. We stand beside you. On that note, we'll move to our communications from the public. This is time set aside for the public to comment on items that are on the agenda but not advertised as a public hearing. So if you're here to speak on the planned unit development, please hold until we call that agenda item. But anything else you'd like to discuss or present to the council, now is your opportunity. Your name and address for the record, please.
Good evening, Mary Flowers, citizen for a Better Flathead, 35 4th Street West in Kalispell. I wanted to update you that the county will again be considering the Highway 93 entrance corridor zone on Thursday, the 28th. There will not be public comment, but there is at 8:45 an opportunity to speak prior to that hearing. I have brought you 2 discs. One includes all the documents that they are considering part of the record for that hearing, as well as the audio file of the planning director briefing the commissioners on that zone and how they're approaching it. We will be asking the commissioners during that 45-minute or during that brief public comment period a couple of things. One is that as they move forward and as they discuss this, if they're going to adopt, make changes to the findings, if they're going to add additional information on which to base their decision, we think that should go back to a public hearing process so the public can comment on it as well. So I'm going to encourage them to, as they discuss this and as they make additional recommendations, that they reopen this to a public hearing process. Secondly, at the last hearing, Commissioner Kruger, I thought, raised a very good question, which I want to encourage them to get an answer to. And one of the question he asked was, he said, when you look at the development that is existing on the northern part of that corridor, a lot of it's in place without adequate setbacks that we might want to see. But when you look at the southern part of that corridor, which is mostly agricultural, there's still opportunity to put some standards in place to really kind of create more of a appealing setback. He said, give me some suggestions as to how that could be accomplished. So I hope that will be answered. I want to remind them about that. I also think it's important, and if you have, I'll be asking, but I would like to provide the city or the county some of the history of how you took from Highway 40 into essentially Spokane Avenue, or not Spokane, but towards the city, and did that landscaping. I believe that you worked with the highway department so that you used part of their right-of-way, and I think telling that story would be good for the council, for the commissioners to understand that in an entrance corridor, it's not just that you're bound by the existing buildings there, but you have opportunities to be more creative. That's something that your planning director in comments or whoever you might send to comment could share and just raise awareness about as well. So I will, I also have copies of the agendas that are so you can follow along on these documents. So I will give those to Michelle.
Thanks, Mary, for your comments. Who's next? Any further public comment tonight? We'll stay with the audience. Any volunteer board reports this evening from the audience? Not seeing any, we'll move on to our consent agenda. Are there any volunteer board reports from the council? Richard's nodding, so we'll start with Richard.
Just very briefly, if anybody we'd love to have you come to the Climate Action Plan Committee meeting on the 27th at 5 o'clock, 5 to 7, and we keep it right to 2 hours, so it's only 2 hours out of your day.
Thanks, Richard. Further volunteer board reports from the council? Katie.
Maybe. There we go. The Whitefish Strategic Housing Committee met and we had our open house last Wednesday and we had a great attendance. I'm encouraging all of you, if you have any questions or want to review the housing needs assessment or any of the information that we're dealing with regarding this document, go online to whitefishhousing.com and start creeping around. We have a lot of information. We have the housing needs assessment and we have a series of surveys that you'll be able to take and become more involved, and stay tuned for more.
Thanks, Katie. Further reports? Not seeing any, I'll move on to item 5, which is our consent agenda. Any changes or additions to the minutes from September 5th, or can I have a motion? Richard.
I have, I think, a need for a correction on page 21. The very last sentence says he thinks partly also the was, and that did not, and that was Andy. And so maybe Andy could, I think that was you, Andy, clean that up, that last sentence, so it makes sense. You have a suggestion, Andy? You'll do that? Okay, Michelle will do that. With that, I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Is there a second to the motion?
As amended.
I second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously. Michelle, which brings us on to our first and only public hearing of the evening, which will be Ordinance 17-26, an ordinance zoning text amendment to revise Section 11-2S planned unit development to address blending of densities and other issues as recommended by the PUD Revision Ad Hoc Committee, WZTA 17-02. This is on a first reading. It's continued from our September 5th, 2017 meeting. And I know Richard has...
Just as a, Mr. Mayor, if I may, as a point of order, I want to make a motion to remove from the table for further consideration an ordinance to revisit 1125, which is now going to be ordinance 17-26. The reason for doing that is that the original minutes indicated that on August 21st that it was tabled to be, and then confused with a continuance. And so just to make sure that no one thinks that, or we're not accused of any kind of impropriety, I move to take it from the table, bring it back, and while it does not require a second, it will require a majority vote.
All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and the motion removes it from the table and brings it back for discussion. On that note, we do have a planning staff report included in the packet, which begins on page 25, and I'll turn it over to Dave Taylor. For the public's benefit, we did hold a work session in advance of this meeting to discuss both the committee's draft as well as some of the proposed revisions that came from the planning department at the request of Adam and myself. And I've asked Dave to briefly, since we've already gone over this 2 times now, just to provide a consolidated Cliff Notes version of his staff report and the version being recommended by both the committee as well as the planning office. Dave.
Good evening. So, yeah, this started, well, a little over a year and a half ago. The City Council looked at some potential changes to the PUD chapter. They weren't happy with the staff suggestions, and they decided to form an ad hoc committee to look at the PUD chapter. And so an ad hoc committee was formed. The committee spent about a year going through the PUD chapter, and as of the beginning of the summer, they had a draft that they felt comfortable with, and that went to the Whitefish Planning Board. The Planning Board reviewed their draft and forwarded it to the City Council with a recommendation of approval. The draft looks at the intent of the PUD chapter and adds a lot of new language in there, sort of fleshing that out. It also looked at some objectives for a PUD and added some new language for that. The recommended draft from the Planning Board also looked at the PUD types and uses, and they recommended splitting that into 4 different PUD types based on the underlying zoning: residential, commercial, light industrial, and mixed use. The draft also looked at reducing some of the density that would be allowed with a bonus for affordable housing for the high-density residential and commercial zones. It also looked at the open space requirements and added some provisions in there, kind of laying out how you could count open space. It reduced what you can count as open space to only 50% if it's encumbered by the floodplain or the water quality ordinance. They looked at the community benefit chapter, added a whole new chapter on community benefits that lay out what type of community benefits are expected in exchange for being able to reduce development requirements such as setbacks and road standards. And there's a whole list of different types of community benefits, including environmentally sensitive areas, natural features, sustainable development techniques, affordable housing, overall design. And then the committee also revamped the affordable housing chapter of the PUD, laying out the expectations for affordable housing, laying out some conditions that the units look similar, added some additional language if the affordable units are provided off-site, which wasn't in the old code, fleshed out land in lieu, which had a very small part in the old code, and then some more language about timing and phasing, that the market rate units and the affordable units would be done in the same phases and not at a later phase. They added some additional information to the application procedure, including a written report on any citizen outreach. Also some additional language on if there's an HOA, who's responsible if the HOA doesn't continue to take care of the property, and giving the city the right to come in and mow weeds and other things. And then some other additional language about a mitigation agreement for the housing authority and how that's activated. And then some language about a statement of intent that would be required when someone applied for something. After the draft went to the planning board, I was approached by the city manager and asked to respond to some questions that he had received from some members of the development community, and also at the request of the mayor, because there was some perception that some of the new things that were added into this draft would be an impediment for them to use this document, or to make it less flexible and less usable. So staff provided some suggested changes for the council to consider that might make it somewhat more flexible, including on the PUD types, going back to the way it's been in the past, as far as residential development being able to be in any zoning district except industrial, and the commercial PUD be specific to commercial developments, so that you couldn't, in the draft that's being presented from the planning board and the PUD committee, you currently cannot blend commercial and residential property to do a residential PUD, unless it's a mixed-use PUD with a commercial element in there. And staff suggested change would allow for commercial residential blended PUD that's just for residential purposes. We also suggested some changes to the density. We felt like we didn't want to remove any incentives to do affordable housing. And also the trends are to do more efficiency units, so we just felt like limiting the amount of density. It should be based on a case-by-case project. Someone could come up with a 3-story building full of efficiency units and blow our density out of the water, but still provide a bunch of affordable housing. We also looked at the open space requirement, and we felt like penalizing someone that has floodplain or water quality protection by only allowing them to count 50% of that gross acreage. We didn't feel like that was fair. And that requirement, because it's in the PUD chapter, if someone's doing a PUD, whatever's in our water quality ordinance chapter with regard to being able to count as open space, this would trump that. So you would still only be able to count 50% in the PUD. And then we also added some language to deal with hardscapes on non-residential projects and being able to count those towards open space. And remember that any non-residential project also includes a requirement for landscaping, so they'd have to incorporate a percentage of that, any project have landscaping anyway. And Andy made a suggestion that we would have some language in there that would exclude parking lots, and I think that's okay, and we could add that in there. And then the other changes had to do with adding the word voluntary on the citizen participation report to make sure that was clear. And then we also had some language that made it clear that the housing mitigation agreement would be a draft agreement when it was submitted with its application, and that a final agreement would be reviewed by the city council, just to clarify that. So all in all, yeah, I urge you guys to hear public comment and discuss it, and we certainly recommend approval of some sort of amendment to our PUD ordinance so that we can move on.
Thanks, Dave. Any questions for Dave on his staff report? Not seeing any. We did advertise for a public hearing on what will be ordinance 17-26, and we'll hold that public hearing now. I do have a short list of folks that signed up to speak. I'll call on those individuals first, but certainly if you would like to comment, please do. And just for the record, your name and address, please. We'll start with Judy.
Good evening to the council, mayor, and those attending this evening. I am Judy Spivey, 725 Clearwater Drive, Whitefish. I am not against change and growth. Both are inevitable. I want to make several comments, the subject being, don't let Whitefish become any town USA. First, I urge you to accept the PUD rewrite as submitted by the thoughtful, careful, hard-working committee. It is succinct, to the point, and accurate. I'd like to recount several conversations I've heard during my almost 30 years tenure in Whitefish. On a plane from California, I heard two men having met as seatmates. Both were developer builders. One was on his first look-see, having heard of Whitefish and what we all know our city has to offer. The other, a more experienced developer builder, said to the first, "Whitefish is great, you can do anything you want to do." I was very angry. Second, I recall a comment spoken in a public meeting by a planning staff member in discussing the ease of and comparatively casual PUD approvals, which were then occurring several years ago. Comment was, "We've always done it this way." Finally, I was upset about the request for planning staff alternative recommendations because developer builders had complained that the rewrite was too stringent. In my own personal opinion, that's tough. Too bad. In the alternative recommendations, the very meat of the rewrite of our city R&Rs is basically, the meat of it is eliminated. The rewrite's a tiny part of the necessary overdue rewrite of the city R&Rs. We still have much to do. My question is, who has the precedent here? The wishes, desires, hopes, works of Whitefish residents, or the developer builders? I challenge the council and staff to be clear. Concerns for the present and future of the Whitefish majority are primary. I urge you to do what is right for our city. As an addendum, developers, builders, entrepreneurs, all are doing their job. We must do our job. Clear, concise, accurate ordinance, codes, rules, and regs are necessary and prudent. They help everybody and avoid angst. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Next on the list is Ann Moran. And that's the extent of the list. So again, please provide comment if you'd like.
Thank you, Mayor Mofield. I'm Ann Moran. I live at 432 West 3rd Street. I am a former member of the Highway 93 West Corridor Study Group Committee, and I work and have worked for about 20 years in real estate, in development, residential and commercial, planning, all aspects, private and government land. And I'm here to comment that I support the work that the committee has done. I'm very concerned and also would comment that many people in my neighborhood have expressed concern to me about the blended use aspect of what has come forward recently here. I certainly recognize the planning staff is, investigating what they've been asked to investigate, but this raises a lot of concerns among many of us. And one of the biggest reasons it does is whether you are on the developer side of the fence or whether you are on the residential homeowner side of the fence, there is no greater utility or benefit than predictability. I have been on the developer side of a fence where we had to deal with an ambiguous development. It cost us $10,000 one night to have the people we needed to have at a meeting to work through the stuff we needed to work through because everybody wasn't on the same page in a community. And it is a really unfortunate thing when we want to try to leave things open enough that a developer doesn't come in and understand predictably how a neighborhood is going to react when they come in with a proposal. And if we let it be known to developers that it may be comfortable for them to come in and blend uses in our community where a neighborhood like mine has time and time and time and time again expressed concern about that, it's not fair to the developer to engage in a process like that that's got a lot more road bumps in it than they think it's going to have at the outset. And it takes some courage to set things up, but in the long run, predictability is best for everybody. It's the most practical, useful thing. I think it's really, really important right now at Whitefish's point to sustain a sense of community here. One of the things that I did earlier in my career was a lot of studying of resort communities. And one of the biggest challenges is a sustainable long-term community, not just a transient community. And I think Rhonda had a really good point about when she was discussing in your work session, Mr. Lapp's comments relative to residential areas. If we had some more areas like what we have with just some single-family homes, I own single-family home rentals, and I can tell you there is a crying need for them in this community. It is something that it's important also that when we are dealing with committees like this that we appoint and they spend a lot of time on something and they bring something forward, they work usually, or at least what I've seen, they work pretty hard to try to bring everybody's views to the table. And this council, when you react on these things, you send a message to those of us who are volunteers in the community. And you have a lot of messages to send in your job. I understand it. I recognize that. I hope that you send messages that you value and support the work that they do, and that you recognize that sometimes you may have difficult decisions to make to prevent more difficult decisions later and to not set us up for neighborhood conflict. Those are my comments, and thank you.
Thanks, Ann. Who's next? Rebecca.
Rebecca Norton, 530 Scott Avenue. I actually got involved because of a PUD in my neighborhood. And Andy, I think, was mayor at that time. Richard was working on it too. I didn't know anything at that time. And we got like over 100 people to show up against a development along the river. And some of what we were worried about did happen. We've recently had some slumpage on a failure of the slope, and so there was damage to the river at another point because all the water from Caro came down and put a huge plume into the river. Luckily, it was the same year that the railroad was required to clean it up. So since that time, which is about 10 years ago, I've kind of been really interested in the perception that the city gives to citizens when we do planning. And I think not only is it to avoid litigation, but it's also our reputation when we don't have a predictable way that developers' needs are met, as well as protecting homeowners' investments. So I am in favor of the committee's recommendations as they stand. I think they did an amazing amount of work to allow us to have PUDs, but also to make sure that whoever buys into Whitefish and currently lives in Whitefish knows what could be built to them. And if it slows the process down a little bit, we'll find a way to work around that too. I like Mr. Lapp's suggestion of making it a little bit easier to read. So the 4 types of PUDs have a lot more easy reading, and someone can just pick it up and understand it. I think some of our writing could be easier to read for people that don't know the language. I just have one, otherwise I think I like all of it. I just have one really small suggestion, which is sound. I was at a county meeting once when we were going through the donut process, and Don Kay got up and he was talking about people in the apartments near his establishment complaining about noise because they did deliveries early in the morning. So that's going to be a big build out probably in that area. So if we could add a community benefit that would include sound mitigation, I would like to see that. When I brought it up at the planning board, they've said that we can't really do anything about it. It costs more, but I think it is a community benefit when we're going to go more and more dense, especially in the commercial and mixed use areas. So I really appreciate the committee's work a lot and for caring enough about the community to put the time in. And good luck with your decision. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. Who's next? Mary.
Good evening again. Mary Flowers, 35 4th Street West, Kalispell, Citizens for a Better Flathead. And you have from the work session a detailed set of comments, and I ask that those be made part of this hearing record as well. And you also have in your packet, which I encourage you as you review the comments that I've submitted at the planning board, I submitted a couple of charts, which I hope are very helpful to you, both in looking at what existing zoning districts allow, what densities and what types of housing they allow in them, and to really cross-reference that with some of the suggestions that I'm making. Additionally, I've provided a chart that compares some of the PUD standards in other communities to give you a sense that what the committee has recommended, and I was a committee member, is not something way out in left field, but is something that is very typical of what is being used elsewhere in the state. And and I believe has merit for you to consider, as the committee brought it forth. However, in my comments, I have broken out a number of issues that I want to touch on that I think as a committee we still need to go back and do a little tweaking on, and would ask your indulgence to give us some direction and allow us to do that. One of the main points I want to say is that I believe the suggestion, the primary suggestion by the planning director to remove our recommendation for what can be blended within a residential zone essentially guts the heart of the work that I feel we were asked to do by this council. The solution that we came up was to allow the blending of densities only between zones that permit similar uses and to prevent the neighborhood incompatibility blending of commercial and residential uses. The proposed committee solution does allow for mixed-use PUDs that generally incorporate within a commercial development a zone for multifamily or single-family housing. So you have that as an option, but by removing a residential PUD that limits the blending to only similar zones, you have taken us back to square one, essentially, because what brought us here was things like Whitefish Crossing and the MK Enterprises and the 2nd Street, I'm forgetting what that development was called, but that's development as well, where the neighbors in those, to those developments said, wait a minute, we bought in and we wanted more predictability, and where they had to fight. They had to hire attorneys to try to represent them to get anyone to listen. That's not the kind of predictable, fair, open system that we want, and I think that's why you challenged us to bring you some suggestions. So what happens when you blend a low-density residential with a high-density commercial is that you increase the density, you allow for the increase of density blended across that district, so that almost by formula, you're going to end up with more multifamily housing than you are the kind of housing which is really desirable within, according to the housing study that's just moving forward, single-family homes are what is really desired. Yes, we're going to always need multifamily housing, but what you also need to look at is what type of multifamily housing is appropriate within these existing residential zones that don't currently allow it at all. And so I fleshed that out in this memo. I really think it is really hard to wrap your arms around what you're being asked to adopt. As a committee, we really struggled with it, and I wrote long memos, just like I gave you tonight, for us to try to work through it. And I really ask that what I think you need to ask of your planning staff, for the public and for yourself, is to come back to you at another work session where the public has time to review it ahead of time, as well as yourself, concrete examples of where what we've proposed to you will not work. Give us examples and take some concrete developments or potential developments and say, how will this work? With Charles Lapp's property, what if he had put in a PUD with affordable housing? He didn't, when talking after the meeting, he said, I don't really know what the cost benefits would have been to me. Well, one of the things, if we're not conveying that message and we're not really encouraging developers to understand how this can work, our planning office needs to figure out, and what we hear in Kalispell is that their PUDs are used because their council and their planning office say jointly, this is what we want. And so when a development project comes in, the planning staff says, you want us to work with you? We think this needs to be a PUD. We need to look at that kind of attitude to really make sure that PUDs are being used effectively in our community. But to really understand this, I would ask that you, again, table this for this evening and ask your staff to come back with some real concrete examples that we can discuss rather than just words on paper. Get to the section that had some additional notes. So the recommendations that came to you from our committee, I feel that I'm largely supportive of, but I feel like, and I've broken this out in the comments to you, that there are some areas that we need to go back and look at again. And I think one thing that we didn't do, and as I've looked at and listened to some of this input on the housing study and listened to some of the development community, what I feel we're not really looking at is how are our PUDs generating the kind of housing that our community really needs. Do we really need, right now, with the changes that the planning office is proposing, what we will get is a whole lot more high-density multifamily housing. And I think we need to go back as a committee and really provide you some criteria to help ensure that what we're really making sure is that, like in the Whitefish crossing, we're not getting a commercial parking lot put on residential property because it's not really housing, so it's just commercial, it's just a parking lot, but that parking lot could have been single-family housing. We need to make sure, just as the same thing happened in the MK proposal enterprises, we need to make sure that we are encouraging the best residential uses that the city wants. And so I think we need a little more work to get there and to bring you some criteria that will help better ensure that. I really want us as a committee, and I want you to think about what happens when you have a set of regulations that say all multifamily housing, and this is a change from your original regulations allowed multifamily housing. This even allows it more open-endedly to say that any number of units can be multifamily housing. So when you have a low-density residential area and you're inserting a multifamily high-density use that's not permitted in that underlying zone, that's really a question of if that's compatible. So that's another issue I think you need to look at. As I mentioned in the workshop, the inclusion of the business service district, I think that should be removed from the PUD. It's just inviting the county to use that as a tool to blend WB2 and the business service district, which is what the proposal before you would allow. And so it would be consistent for the county to take that district and to allow that blending to occur. I also would like you to think about neighborhood commercial. And again, your zoning regulations, as you've well recognized, are dated and they need to be updated. But we're working with what we have. And in the former PUD that was rarely used, it allowed as an incentive neighborhood commercial within residential PUDs. I think we need to go back and look at that, because what you've seen from the work that you've done in your downtown plan, that Whitefish is really one neighborhood. And as somebody was commenting here earlier, when they were talking to Big Mountain, they said, well, our employee housing, employees don't want to live up here. They want to live in town. What we need to make sure is that we are not encouraging inappropriate commercial outside of our downtown core and our quarters where we already allow for it, so that we're not adding to so that we're keeping Whitefish a one neighborhood, because essentially the commercial services should be focused on our downtown for the neighborhood type uses. Within your ordinance, the wording that's in your packet, there's a couple of wording there under point number 9 on page 5 in my comments, where it says, whereas the council finds that the proposed text amendment supports historic code interpretations and land use patterns. I think what we don't want to do is necessarily have wording that says we're supporting what we've done in the past, because what you've asked us to do is to look at the new realities before us in this community and to provide you recommendations that are more fitting to the current, not the historic patterns, because by linking back to the historic patterns, you're talking about all the blending that was problematic that brought us to this point. So I would ask you to look at changing that wording, as well as the wording that says avoid, that these regulations are appropriate because they avoid undue concentration of people by helping spread evenly this development across the site. Well, that's not the intent of PUDs. The intent of PUDs is to encourage appropriate clustering away from environmentally sensitive areas, not to evenly spread density. So those are kind of technical points, but I think they are important when you're putting them into an ordinance. And again, I just looked up this ordinance again, or this regulation under your water quality regulations. It says these water quality protection regulations shall apply as an overlay and in addition to the zoning of other regulations adopted by the city. Maybe you need to get a legal interpretation, but I can't imagine why you would say within that regulation that 100% of that can count as open space and say somehow it doesn't apply in a PUD zone. So I think that the issue raised there needs to be addressed, and maybe you can get some legal advice on if it applies in these PUD regulations. Don mentioned to you in your work session the need to consider, as Bozeman and Missoula and other communities do, specific overlay districts where you really want to focus on having a little more predictability and higher quality development, like your highway corridors, perhaps, of putting an overlay zone with the PUD. That might be something you do in the future, but I think it's something that is important. The suggestion by the planning staff to clarify language to say that conditional uses are simply permitted, I think goes too far. And I've provided some language that Kalispell has that says that while permitted uses can be brought forward, it needs to be recognized that they're not treated the same as a permitted use, but that they may or may not be appropriate given the particular site. But I think we need to look at that language. In closing, the PUD should not be a loophole to avoid or skip what needs to be a zone change or a growth policy change. I disagree with the analysis provided in your packet that says that the changes to the residential PUD and the commercial PUD make it much easier for development to apply for a residential PUD that spans multiple properties and may have different zoning without first having to go through a growth policy change. What you want to do is the outcome here should not be about what the outcome is, but it should be about the underlying zoning. It needs to really ensure that the underlying zoning, the integrity of the underlying zoning is being respected so that you have an opportunity for developers to enhance their development and neighbors to feel that those enhancements are consistent and compatible with their neighborhood. So again, I ask you tonight to, again, table this, to have concrete examples brought back for consideration, and maybe what we need to do, not only to look at the PUD application, but compare it to a subdivision application, because you heard in your workshop, well, we just go to a subdivision because that's easier. Well, let's look at why those are easier, and what is it in our, one of our parking lot issues for you was to go in and to make some corrections to your subdivision regulations. So I think we have a little bit more work to do, and I would encourage you to give us that opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Further public testimony.
Do I need to turn in another copy?
If you don't mind handing me one, and then I can hand that to Michelle, or you can just hand it to Michelle, Mary. That'd be great. Thanks.
Mayor Melfield and councilors, I'm David Hunt, 113 Park Knoll Lane. And I've been here before, and you still have a mountain of information to absorb for this very complex rewrite. I encourage you to accept the PUD committee's original proposal without changes that were provided by Dave Taylor. I understand your desire for more input from all points. It's very complicated and it's important to get right. So I understand asking Dave in the planning office for another perspective on this, and I'm sure that you will factor that in. So I echo support for what Mary and Don said earlier in the workshop session for support for the existing proposal. I want to just stress a couple things here that have been mentioned about amending the gross policy and rezoning. Just for example, if we have existing zones that are commercial, such as WB2, and our growth policy, future use plans for that zoning are to remain as commercial, then I'm not sure why we'd want to make it easier just to change that via PUD. It seems like there's a compelling case here that the existing zoning and the future use plans call for it to be commercial, and yet the PUD makes it an exceptional, easy process to rezone that on the fly, and I think that's where we've had issues with this. Commercial densities blended with low density residential will always be contentious situations along South 93, simply because we've got WB2 fronting the highway on all sides. East and west of that is WLR for the most part. So we have densities that permit 20 units per acre with PUD in the WB2, 5 units per acre with WLR. If you blend those densities, the answer is always going to be 12.5 units per acre. With the bordering properties, WLR, are nominally 2.5 to 3 units per acre. They're going to be buffered in against 12.5 units per acre. And so I think that that's always going to be a challenge, and you'll probably have the council chambers full with residents who were involved in those things. That was part of the motivation that we considered in selecting an approach that said that we would restrict blending of commercial densities and uses versus residential, and hence we came up with the 4 PUD types separated by use. The last comment I want to make is Dave Taylor's suggestion of perhaps counting affordable housing as a community benefit. In rethinking that, it may be something that we can consider in the last example that we talked about in that session, where they're not seeking a density bonus, but if they provide the 10% affordable units and not taking a density bonus, then you might want to consider that as a community benefit for that purpose. Otherwise, it appears as a double accounting, basically. You're getting the density bonus for providing it, and then you're getting a community benefit for providing it again. And that community benefit is supposed to offset additional leniencies that you've sought, you know, in terms of positioning of houses, setbacks, et cetera. So to me, it seems like something that could be pursued in certain cases, but not beyond that. I thank you for indulging all of this. You've got a complicated case to solve here. You may need some more input. input as Mary suggested here, and we'd be happy to help if that's the case. So good luck.
Thanks, David. Further testimony tonight on this item. Don.
I'm Don Spivey, currently temporarily residing at 725 Clearwater Drive in Whitefish. My voice was kind of going south on me, as it did in the work session. And I won't repeat all of that, but I would ask, as Mary did, that my submission to you, and I will offer another one for you to include, and I've also given one already to Michelle, that be included as my public input as well. Mary and David have done a great job of covering much of what I would say, but I just want to come back and address why we got here, a little bit of history that nobody has really talked about for a long time. We sort of skirted it, but we haven't talked about it. David Hunt and I worked through the Whitefish Crossing development process, finally reaching an accommodation with the developer with lots of work and very significant legal expense. We could have stopped there, but we felt that because nothing more was going to affect us as a community, as a subdivision rather, but we decided that the community at large needed something different in terms of a PUD that was more predictable and manageable, and so we started to search and look for how to do that. We had two basic criteria, that the output, the solution would be more predictable, and resolve the questions and concerns about blending commercial and residential units. But also, most importantly, it had to be a solution that had been adopted and implemented successfully in other communities. If it didn't meet those criteria, we didn't even consider it. So everything that we talked about is not a new invention on our part. It's using ideas that we picked up wherever we could. And so that's the background. I went through, and they've already gone through many of the things that I thought were most important. The single biggest issue that I have with the suggested changes that David and Wendy were asked to do was simply in the residential PUD area, where they eliminated all of the underlying zones that were listed before. And that takes us all the way back, as Mary said, to ground zero, essentially negating a very significant part of what the committee worked on for a year and a half. Not all of it, of course, but a very significant portion of it. And that's kind of distressing to me personally, and probably to the committee as a whole. Second, in the density bonus tables, we have maybe the most generous density bonuses in the Northwest, maybe, that we could find anyway. And I don't think anything that the committee recommended did anything to negate the value of the bonuses or negate the bonus densities that were associated with affordable housing. They're still there. There are some zones in there, if you really looked at them, like WR4, where it's almost impossible to achieve even the standard densities, much less with the affordable housing bonus. And I don't think with the other regulations that exist in the community for things like height and parking and so on, that we could ever achieve those kinds of densities anymore. So there's some problem with that. We were also told by one developer that the incentives, well, that the standard available densities in the zones was so generous that they felt there was very little incentive to go for a bonus. That was just one developer who came to one of the meetings and talked to us. Open space, that's something, as you all know, we debated extensively. I think the particular issue with Idaho timber is solved by another regulation. That's not an issue at all. And from my own personal perspective, if a development has lake shores, ponds, wetlands, whatever it might happen to be, floodplains included, if things are done by the developer to make those accessible and usable by the community and by the residential or just the residents of the development, then I think that's fair to call those, count those as open spaces. If they don't do anything with them, I'm not sure they should be counted at all as open spaces. So that's my own personal view of that subject. As you know, the committee chose a different solution. The non-commercial landscapes, where we talked about that never even came up in the committee sessions. And I would just say that every time, any time that the planning staff had a serious problem or an issue with what we were discussing, the committee went to great lengths and great pains to try to find an equitable solution that satisfied the needs of the development community and the planning staff. We also had that requirement, of course, that we always had to have 4 out of 6 members agree to anything we changed in the plan, and most of the votes, the one planning staff member, which was David Taylor, generally voted with a majority in those meetings that he attended, and he attended most of them only when he had to be out of town or someplace else. The affordable housing we've discussed, I mean, I just think that's open to revision by the committees that's working on that subject right now, and but we felt it was very necessary to flesh out some details that were going to be important to understand until any change that they might make to this is incorporated and fully operational. I think the changes that we included in the definition sections on affordable housing options are very useful and meaningful, and they give more of an understanding of what that's all about, and we hope that they're kept there. So I'm not going to say any more, but once again, I would request that the submission that I made to you in the workshop be included as my public record input, and I won't really spend any more time talking about this, and Michelle already has a copy of it, so I think that's been under control. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Don. Appreciate the comments. Further testimony tonight on this item? Bob.
Thank you very much. Bob Horn, 151 Wedgewood Lane in Whitefish. And as most of you know, I've been a community planner, professional community planner for over 40 years. See all this white hair? In that time, I have worked in a lot of communities. I have written a lot of codes for those communities, and above all, I have administered codes for those communities. Doesn't mean I know it all, but it means I've seen a lot of it. I've seen what works, and I've seen what doesn't work. I'm already on record of, I was a member of the PUD committee, and I was the lone dissenting voice. I do not recommend the committee's draft to you. You've got my email of Monday, August 21st, explaining my rationale. I much prefer the staff version. In my assessment, it is not as prescriptive. The prescriptiveness, saying what you can and can't apply for, was the wrong approach. I tried many times to convince my colleagues on the committee, let's don't take that approach. Let's don't take what you put into it. Let's take what you get out of it. The committee draft is not like that. The committee draft is again too prescriptive in that regard. And if it meets with any objection from the development community or the design professionals, it's not because it's too stringent. It was suggested earlier. It's because it is too prescriptive. We talked about wanting predictability, protect neighborhoods, okay? protect the quality, protect the character. How do you do that? You don't do it by prescribing what you can and can't apply for in what underlying zone. You do it through your approval criteria. Now, I've noticed that no one who has spoke this evening has even mentioned the approval criteria, except for tonight, except for right now. That is what you make your decision on, the approval criteria. You should be able to apply for a residential PUD in a residential zone or a commercial zone, especially in a community like Whitefish where we have an abundance. We have more commercial zoning than we're ever going to use. Mixed use, you should be able to apply in a commercial zone. Commercial PUD in a commercial zone. Multiple underlying zones, keep the commercial in the commercial zone. If not, request a zone change. There are criteria, there are legal requirements for requesting a zone change. A PUD is not supposed to be a backhanded use variance, okay? You're not supposed to be putting commercial uses in area zone residential. That is breaking the contract that you made with the community whenever you approve the zone. Open space at 50%, I've seen, I don't know where Dave came up with the number, but I've seen lots of codes that do just that. That say if you've got, say, an area that's undevelopable, let's say I've got a 10-acre property and 2 acres are a marsh, okay? And if I make that accessible and it's good wildlife habitat, I'm preserving that, I can maybe count that at 50% open space. But on the other hand, I shouldn't be able to count all of that 2 acres as my gross property area to establish my density. If I can only count 50% open space, I should only be able to count 50% of that to establish my baseline density. Mary Flowers asked for concrete examples. I suggested some beta testing, and we could have done some beta testing had we not spent most of the committee's time making this draft ordinance, making the committee's product so prescriptive. Compatibility, I've already covered that, but how do you control that? Once again, it's through the approval criteria. Another suggestion that I made in my email of August 21st was to say, with specific regard to paragraphs D and F in section 11.2S1, and those are the purpose and intent section on the very first page. We're talking items D and F. D is preserve and protect the character and qualities of existing neighborhoods. See, there it is. It's part of the approval criteria. F is provide effective buffers or transitions between potentially, incompatible uses of land. I suggest that we have some language in here that says something like this. With specific regard for paragraphs D and F in section 11.2S1, it is the city's preference that new development be integrated into existing neighborhoods in terms of scale, quality, character, and street continuity. When in the judgment of the city, such integration is not possible, practical, or will otherwise produce desired outcomes, desired outcomes for the existing neighborhood, effective buffering and transitions will be expected of the new development. What that means is we should be building neighborhoods and not individual developments. Our first preference should be something of a similar scale, quality, and character. And I'll get back again, the way you do that is not by telling the developer what he can and can't apply for, it's telling him exactly the kind of development you want in your approval criteria. So tonight I'm going to go a step beyond this and I'm going to make a suggestion. I believe it was brought up earlier tonight that if you look at the very first section, purpose and intent, you've got those 3 bullet paragraphs. They say what you want the PUD to be. Take the rest of these, A through M, these criteria that deal with specific things like open space, compatibility, affordable housing, rewrite them as airtight criteria and put them back here under approval of the plan unit development. require the developer to address every criteria, including if he feels like one's not applicable, explain to us why it's not applicable. Say that the council shall not approve any project that does not conform to these criteria. Okay. Use this to guide the quality and character of the PUD that you come out with, not the prescription of what you can and come out with. So that sounds like major surgery. It's not. Okay, it could be done very easy. Again, these purpose and intent statements on these specific elements could be rewritten very easily, as I said, for really effective criteria. And that would lead, I think, to what you're looking for, which is protection and predictability for existing neighborhoods. And developers like predictability just as much as the community, if not more so. I appreciate Dave Taylor's desire to move on, but I feel like we're not ready yet. We're not there. This is not ready for prime time. I could talk about this all night. I could put you all to sleep, but I won't. I too encourage a continuance, okay? There are a lot more details I could cover, but I wanted to paint the big picture for you tonight, and that's that I think that this ordinance that's come from the committee is backwards. Okay. With that, I'll be, again, encourage a continuance and be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Bob. If we have questions, we can call on you later after we hear from the rest of the public. Further comments tonight? Thanks.
Hi, good evening. Wendy Coyne. I live at 1058 Meadowlark Lane. I previously lived over in River's Edge, and for some of you that met me through that process of the Marriott 10 acres from 93 back to the river, I just wanted to remind some of you that may not have heard this story before the kinds of things that we went through as a neighborhood. And really the PUD committee came out of what happened in that 10 acre piece of property behind us. And it was the affordable housing, the possibility of that. It was the Marriott Hotel. It was multi-use and single family. And because of the confusion around the blending and the density that was going to happen through this, the neighborhood had to hire an attorney. It was contentious at some times. And what was interesting in this process was the guy that actually is building the Marriott, the owner of it, at one point said to us, boy, if we had only known how the neighbors felt, we could have come to an agreement with them ahead of time. Because what they were told and what actually happened when they started to put forward the building of the Marriott were two different issues. And, you know, the affordable housing thing that happened that actually didn't happen off of that property, you look at these things and you say to yourself, is it really smart for us to have such a high density usage in a neighborhood when you know you're going to get fighting from it? And you know that it's going to be difficult to come to some sort of an agreement if there's not this constant work together as a team. And I just, you know, I'm also on the board of Citizens for a Better Flathead, and I see the work that the committee has put together in the last year. And it's like it's all falling apart because of what has now been proposed. So I also agree that we should step back from this. I know this has been a long process. Everybody wants this to end. But as someone that's gone through this process and lived it and actually moved from where I was and did all kinds of work to figure out that someone couldn't build and do something behind the property that I now live in, because I now know what it feels like to have a big surprise behind you as an owner, and as I've been a taxpayer in Whitefish for over 17 years. And the last story I will remind you of is meeting a woman that said to me that her realtor told her that you could no longer trust Whitefish when you were buying land because of the regulation that was happening with the PUD. I had this conversation with her, and she was looking out at some property, and the realtor said to her, we can't trust this anymore because they don't have their act together in Whitefish, so you need to understand that you could have some commercial property or something building next to you over time. And she moved to another community. So we just have to watch ourselves and make sure that we're doing what's right for everybody. We all understand development's going to happen, and just allowing the multi-use of commercial and residential properties for most neighborhoods are really not going to work out. And so we've got to look at this and think about what's going to happen long term. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your comments. Who's next? Rhonda.
Good evening, Mayor and Councilors. Rhonda Fitzgerald, 412 Lupfer Ave. I think we're so lucky in our community to have so many knowledgeable and dedicated volunteers who are willing to take the time to really work through such a complicated process as the PUD. And I think the committee that spent a year and a half on it did incredibly good work. And I would just like to second their comments. Tonight, I'm not as knowledgeable about the whole process as they are, but I think they really wrangled with something that is fundamental to our understanding of our community and its character. There are many, many neighborhoods in our community that are vulnerable through the PUD process as proposed by the Planning Department's revisions. And I think that this sense that you cannot feel confident of, where you live, the largest investment you'll ever make in your life, is daunting. And there are a few items here that I would like to highlight that I see as problems. I know that I brought these up to the committee a few times, some of them, and they pointed out that their focus was fairly narrow. So the revisions they brought you all dealt with the blending pretty much and dividing those zones separately so there would be commercial, residential, mixed use. What I would point to the new housing needs assessment, which is a terrific result of the whole affordable housing conversation, because through this needs assessment, we learned what we really need and how much of it we need and at what price points. And one of the things that I felt was so important is that we learned that of the units we need, and we need over 600 right now to make the gap, and another 100 a year till 2020. What we learned is that half of those are for rent and for lower average median income, a lower percentage of average median income. The other half of those units that we need are single-family homes, modest homes with a yard and storage close to downtown. People want to live close to downtown, and that sounds to me like the definition of our traditional neighborhoods all around town, and so we need more of that. And I would hope that all of our planning could focus on actually finding us the ways to have that come to fruition. But what I see in the revisions recommended tonight is exactly the opposite. A recommendation to allow commercial PUDs in the R3 and R4 residential zones by right. Those are the neighborhoods around town. And as Bob Horn just said, you're breaking a contract with the people who live in those neighborhoods. And they don't come every 2 weeks to city council and say, please honor our neighborhood. Please remember we care about the character of our community. They assume that's what they elect you for. And they assume that that's what their friends and neighbors who volunteer want to respect. And I just think that, there's no momentum for people to just show up and say, don't forget, we want to keep our character intact. But that is what they want. And quite a few things are attacked by these revisions that were proposed. And a second point I'd like to make is that the idea, the example of how people have a commercial zone and, that it's really difficult to turn it into a residential development. Really the reverse is much more likely to come before you. And that is what happens all the time is people want to increase buy a lower value property and transfer it to a higher value use. And it's not the other direction. So any example given to you, just think what it means in reverse, because I think that's much more likely what we're really talking about. Another amendment or refinement that was proposed is to move not only to have allowable uses, but to also make any conditional uses permitted become by right. Well, that's the part where the neighborhood gets to come forward and say, we don't like this. That's the conditional use process. If you give them those conditional uses by right, then where's the neighborhood? They're left hanging out to dry because you've taken away all of their leverage that they have to defend their neighborhood. I would back up the comment that the reason nobody uses the density bonus is because the densities are too high. How about we lower the densities that are allowed in some of those zones? They are ridiculously high, and hence no one does affordable housing to get a bonus. So I think there's a way to solve that. You should think about lowering the densities. I brought this up to the committee. They're like, we have a narrow focus. We're just trying to stick with the blending problem. The business service district is just not a good thing. It breeds strip sprawl. I think it's an out-of-date planning idea that time has passed. All you get are these little commercial things plopped around, and then of course people want to connect those dots, and pretty soon you've got a strip. So the business service district should just be crossed out, in my opinion. Another thing that I would do if I were working on a PUD process is I would look at those community benefits, and a lot of them should not be considered a community benefit. They should be standards. You should require connectivity to bike ped paths and many other things that are considered a community benefit. In our community, those should be required. And I think that that would be very much in keeping with maintaining our character. And you know, maybe that's a tough hill to climb, but let's look at what we really think is an awesome benefit that allows you a bunch of extra goodies, or what we think we should just expect people to provide. And finally, I love Bob Horn's idea that you would have a pre-submittal where neighbors could hear about what you're planning before it gets very far along, and everyone could discuss it, and maybe there could be understanding and accommodations made. Half the problem is you find out about these things on a Friday, and you have to come to a city council meeting on a Monday, and the fix is already in a lot of times. And you know, why can't everyone be talking about it instead of whispering about it and worried about it? And you know, there are several projects right now that lots of people know things about, but the people who live near them don't. And I think that that would be a really great idea if there could be encouraged by the planning department when people come to the planning department that they say, you know, let's get the public involved. Let's discuss this. Because if it can't make muster with the public in a pre-process, then it's not going to be very popular in the final hearing. Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda. Further public testimony tonight? Further comments? Not seeing any. I'll go ahead and close the public hearing and turn it back to the council for discussion. Who would like to begin? Frank.
Somebody has to start. I was part of the committee, and I do applaud the work that was done on their draft. I agree that there probably are some tweaks and some things that need to be done to it. I think the recommended changes that David came up with and that he was asked to come up with don't square very well, in my view, with what the committee was charged to do. I am sensitive to this idea of whether or not what we're doing is, quote, too prescriptive, as Bob defined it. I still don't quite understand what that means and why that's true, and I would like to understand that better. We are about outcomes, but we're also about some predictability, and that's one of the reasons that we had this. And being prescriptive, using the criteria, maybe that's the way to get to it, but keep in mind that the charge that was given and the problem that was presented to the committee was the problems associated with the blendings of very high density property and very low density property. The committee, I think, struggled with that and came up with some pretty good ideas. Now, are they perfect? No. And maybe it needs some more work? Yes. And there's another thing that I still don't quite understand, and I quite frankly, as a result, until I do, I'm not willing to support either draft at this particular point, is I do not understand David's comments earlier and remain, I've tried very hard, and I have a little background that should allow me to do this, but I still don't, and I'll admit that I probably can learn some more. But I do not understand why under the old PUD, right, wrong, or indifferent, if they want to do certain things, they're not required to go for a zone change or a growth policy change, but under the new PUD statute that you would be required to do in some cases. I don't understand that. At the same time, I would also say that, at least in my view, the reason that we have a growth policy and the reason we put the time into creating the growth policy is that we wanted it to be observed. And so if what we're going to do with a PUD would be in violation of a growth policy with respect to that piece of property, I quite frankly think we ought to go through the brain damage or require us going through the brain damage of changing the growth policy. I think that we shouldn't be offended by that, in my view. So with that said, I would move that we table or what's ever appropriate. I would be willing to continue to work with David and one or two others, maybe another member of this council, and maybe a member of the committee that was appointed, to try to work through and understand the nuances of what I don't understand and see if we can't iron out those inconsistencies or concerns that were expressed. Quite frankly, the issue I've got with the idea that the development community doesn't like it or is uncomfortable with it is it kind of falls on deaf ears, in my view. They will work with whatever we present them. What we want to do is present them something they want to work with. I get that, because I think, as everybody has suggested, we'll get better product and we'll get better project if it's something we ask people to use and we make it easier for them to use. And that's what I'm struggling with here. Prescriptiveness, as I understand it, is not a bother, because we have some ideas about what we want where and how things should look, and that's all right. And so I want to understand what we mean by prescriptiveness in your terms, Bob, in terms of what we're asking people to, what they can and can't apply for. I don't understand that, but I would like to understand that better. So with that said, that's my motion for the time being.
Can you reiterate the motion, please?
Motion
I
is-
allowed you to elaborate because if we have a motion to table and it's seconded, there will be no discussion.
I know,
So-
and that's why I want to be
Yeah.
I want to be careful
I
about
appreciate
that,
your
John, because I
comments.
want to invite any other comment that we have before I do that. So if you want me to hold back before I make that motion, but I think that's that would be probably the appropriate motion
I agree.
to move it forward. So
Are there any other comments before Frank proposes a motion? Andy and then Jen. Bob? We don't know yet. There has been no formal motion.
no, I withdrew whatever I was to
Andy.
invite for the motion. Thank you.
I was just going to ask if it's more appropriate to refer back to the committee for these changes and then represent to the council in its final form.
I don't have a strong opinion about that, Jen. I don't.
I guess a number of comments. First of all, I think we've heard enough from people that are actually proponents of the changes, saying that we need to step back, and from people that certainly don't like the changes that we need to step back, and I agree with that. And I could go through all of my notes of points that pretty much everybody made somewhere along the line that said that we need to step back a little bit. I think from me personally, some of the issues that I had before have been addressed a little bit. But the big issue that I don't think we've addressed with this, and this is what's disappointing to me in it and what I think really needs to be worked on, and I think Erica, who left unfortunately, and we maybe have different ideas about what those incentives for use are, what I don't see that we've done with this is we don't get many PUDs in this community, period. And what we haven't done with this is, one, either encourage people to use them. We haven't really provided, and I don't know what those incentives are necessarily. I'm from the development community. It's always going to be, I want an economic incentive. That's not it. They're intrinsic benefits for us as a community, I think. But I don't think we've provided the incentives or the initiative for people to actually use the PUD process in this community. And that's where I think we fall horribly short with this, not faulting the committee for that. I think the committee did exactly what the committee was pretty well charged to do. So I think they did a good job with that. But we didn't get that next part of it, and that's what I'm concerned about as much as anything. In Mary's notes, 24 in Kalispell. We have like, how many, 5 in the last 10 years? Maybe. And I think this is a very valuable tool, and it becomes a more and more valuable tool as we are trying to infill, as we are trying to buffer against neighborhood, as we're trying to mitigate impacts. Because, David, you had a really good point. We're always going to struggle with that. Gee, we've got something here that's different than here, because zoning always has to have a line of demarcation between different zones. And what we're trying to do with this is create a system that's going to allow the neighborhood to be happy and also allow something that's a little different to happen next door. And I don't see that we've done that here, and that's what I think we really need to work on. I guess what my proposal would be is we don't send it back to the committee. I look at public policy a lot of times as a funnel. And we start with a very broad base, and I think we've created a format for us to work with at this point. So I guess my suggestion, if we move forward with the table, would be to have a couple of members of the committee, a couple of members from the council, and work with staff. We narrow it down to that next step. We go through this. We try and, I think we've heard everybody's issues with what we have here. And I think that's the best way for us to present. I'm afraid if we put it back to the committee, we're looking at another year and a half, and we're going back and around and around and around and around. And I think the committee did a great job in getting us what we have. But going back, I think we need to take a step forward, and I think that's a step forward. We're going to narrow our focus down a little bit, and then I think we can move forward.
Richard, thanks, Andy.
I'm kind of like Andy in that flipping through my notes, I think one of the themes that keeps coming back from just about everyone that has spoken in some way, shape, or form, and that is that we need to not go forward with a decision this evening, that there are some specifics that need to be addressed. There needs to be further consideration of some of the recommendations and suggestions we had both in the work session and in the public hearing, the continuation of the public hearing tonight. One of the notes that I made to myself is that this has turned into kind of a moving target, and I would agree with Andy that we need to somehow settle that target. And maybe what he's proposing is the best way to settle the target. I want to also go back to look at the original charge, and that is that, and what brought us here in the first place, and that is blending across zones rather than blending within zones. And I think that that needs to be well considered as if we decide to take a further look. So I would suggest that we ask our planning staff and perhaps those people that you were suggesting, Andy, to bring back to council essentially a final draft, something that we can say the target has stopped moving, this is the target, this is where we think we should be going. And in order to do that, we should not table, but we should continue the hearing until we can make a decision, because for tabling, for the reasons I suggested at the very beginning, it becomes quite complicated, and I think it's important that we stick with, as best we can, Robert's rules. So to that end, if someone else would like to make a recommendation.
I think you're there.
You think I'm there? I would, well, before I do that, David, how long would it take? I don't want to shortchange anybody. I think it's time to move this thing forward, but I don't want it to want it to be complete. I want this thing in pretty good shape when it comes back to council. How long would something like this take?
I think it's just going to depend on coordinating people's schedules to be able to get everybody to meet together. I would think maybe by the first meeting in November or something like that. Second meeting in October, I don't know.
What's the first meeting in November? November 6th? I'll make a motion.
Quick question, Richard. Are you suggesting that the committee reconvene with the planning staff to bring back a consolidated draft, or to Andy's point that we select a few members of council, a few members at the appointment of the committee, as well as our planning staff to work on a consolidated draft that comes back to the council? I wasn't clear with your direction.
I'm not sure I was very clear. I think that Andy's, but it's certainly subject to further consideration. I think Andy's suggestion is a valid one.
I agree.
So with that, my motion.
Andy.
Just point of order, I think, Richard, probably the proper motion then would be simply to refer to a committee of specificity. Say move to refer this item to a committee comprised of 2 council people, 2 members from the committee, and planning staff until a future date. But I don't think with a refer to a committee you have to have a date.
It would still be a continuance.
It's got to be a continuance of the hearing at some.
But you don't need to set a specified date. But it would be helpful if you identified the composition of that working group.
Okay. Given those suggestions, my motion is to continue discussion of ordinance 17-26. Is that, Angie, probably the best way to do that? Continue the discussion of that ordinance? Or should
I would reference the zoning text amendment to revise 11-2S planned unit development.
Okay. Just so we get this right, to continue the discussion of WTZA 17-02, revision of the PUD, PUD revisions through a working group made of 2 council members, 2 of the original committee members, and planning staff, and bring that back to council for our consideration at their earliest convenience.
Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second with a friendly amendment, if you would, to continue the public hearing along with the discussion.
Understood that it would include continuance of the public hearing. Thank you.
That's okay with the first? Okay. That was seconded by Councilor Franson as amended. Further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. And that carries unanimously. Michelle, thanks everyone for coming this evening, and we'll see you again. I think we're going to continue charging forward. We'll move on to item 7B, which will now be our ordinance 17-26, amending Title 10, Chapter 1, Building Codes of the Whitefish City Code on a first reading, and this appears on page, excuse me? I'm sorry, thank you. We'll back up. And we'll move on to item 7A, Resolution 17-44, a resolution indicating its intent to consider annexing approximately 43 acres of wholly surrounded land into the city of Whitefish, describing the land to be so considered, providing for notice and publication as required by law.
Could we take just a 2-minute?
Sure.
Just while it clears. Thanks.
We're done.
Yeah.
Funny how that works.
Sorry, John. That's all right. You could have let me finish. I'll try again. We'll move on to item 7A, which will be our own resolution 17-44, a resolution indicating its intent to consider annexing approximately 43 acres of wholly surrounded land into the city of Whitefish, describing the land to be so considered, providing for notice and publication as required by law, and providing a date of a hearing of such proposed annexation. And this is on page 140 of your packet. Angie, good evening.
Good evening. Pardon me. So my staff report begins on page 148. And just a little bit of background, I'm sure you guys are all very aware of. The Houston Lakeshore area has been high on the council's list of priority for annexation for several years, I think going back to the 80s. In 2015, property owners in the area sued us seeking a declaratory judgment that we could not annex the area under the wholly surrounded method of annexation. The district court ruled in the city's favor, and in March of this year, the Montana Supreme Court affirmed the district court and held that the Houston Lakeshore area is indeed wholly surrounded. So at our yearly goal-setting work session, the council directed staff to proceed with the annexation, and that's where we are right now. So the resolution in front of you right now is just the first step in annexing the area. We passed a resolution of intention to annex. It does not mean the area is annexed if you guys pass it. If you do pass the resolution of intention to annex, we'll give property owners and taxpayers in the area notice. They will be allowed to submit written comments in support of or against the annexation for a period of 20 days, and then we'll go ahead and hold a public hearing on the annexation itself on November 6th, I believe. So, and of course, under the wholly surrounded method, regardless of whether or not a majority of the property owners protest annexation, the city can still move forward with annexation. So regardless of what method of annexation we use, we have to provide services to the annexed areas in accordance with the plan for extension of services. We do have a plan for extension of services that was passed back in 2009. It's available on our website. Our extension of services plan also requires that the resolution of annexation set forth a method and time frame for bringing the existing conditions in the area to be annexed in compliance with city standards and the parties responsible for the improvements. I have gone through, at least in my staff report, and listed the city services we currently provide and how those services will be provided to the property owners within the Houston Lakeshore area. So again, this is just our first step. If this does pass, we'll give notice. There will be a protest period, and we'll have a hearing on the annexation itself. There's no immediate financial requirements or impacts of passing the resolution of intention to annex. If you ultimately decide to annex the area, it's estimated that the city will collect additional, a little bit more than $96,000 in property taxes and assessment based upon the fiscal year 16 tax rate. So with that said, I'd like to thank Dana and Michelle and Kenny very much. They were hugely instrumental in putting this together, getting the property descriptions and running the tax numbers. So staff thus respectfully recommends that the council, city council approve the resolution of intention.
Thanks, Angie. Any questions for Angie on her staff report? Not seeing any. Motion, discussion? Frank.
I would move that we approve Resolution 17-44, a resolution indicating it's our intent to consider the annexation of approximately 43 acres of wholly surrounded land into the city of Whitefish, Montana, describing the land to be so considered, providing for notice and publication as required by law, and providing the date of hearing for such proposed annexation, which I understand will be November 6th.
Thank you, Frank. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilor Franson. Further discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand, and those opposed, like sign, and that motion carries unanimously. Thanks, Angie. We will stay with Angie and move on to item 7B, which will be ordinance 17-26, amending Title 10, Chapter 1 of our own building code of the city of Whitefish, and this will be on a first reading and appears on page 151 of your packet. Angie.
Good evening again. My staff report begins on page 166. So just as a little bit of background, State law allows cities to adopt model building codes by administrative order. And allowing cities to do that just makes our jobs a little bit easier because it means we don't have to amend our ordinances every time a new version of the code is adopted by the state. And in 2002, the city passed an ordinance which provides that the city manager shall adopt the current edition of the building codes by administrative order. And since then, we have indeed been doing that. Unfortunately, when we passed that ordinance, we didn't repeal all the other subsections that had adopted various different codes. And also, Montana law only allows us to adopt those building codes adopted by the state. Several of the ones that we adopted years and years ago, the state has since decided not to adopt. So it's not a huge deal, but it has created some confusion from people asking, what code am I supposed to be abiding by? And Tad brought it to my attention. And so it's just basically a housekeeping amendment. It clarifies that our city manager is allowed to, or shall, adopt the current codes that the state adopts by administrative order. And every year we get a notice from the state when they do that. And I think the last one was when Chuck was city manager, and he was very, very good about keeping on top of it and issuing orders, adopting those. But it just basically gets rid of all the old codes that we adopted that we are no longer in effect or we're actually precluded from adopting because the state has not adopted them. So there's no financial requirements or impacts, and unless you have questions, I respectfully recommend that you approve the ordinance in front of you.
Thank you, Angie. Further questions for Angie, or any questions for Angie? Motion?
I would move to approve ordinance 17-26, amending Title 10, Chapter 1, Building Codes of the Whitefish City Code.
Is there a second to the motion?
I second.
I think Katie got it.
Katie got it.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and that carries unanimously as well. Michelle? Thanks, Angie. We'll move on to item 8A. You have Adam's report enclosed with the packet. Any questions of Adam from the council? I have a question. How did it go tonight?
It went quite well. There was about 250 people there, I would estimate. So it was pretty crowded. I mean, they were kind of spread out a little bit with some empty seats in between, but I'd say there were pretty close to 250 people. Lots and lots of questions. So, but I think overall it went really well. Of course, there was a variety of opinions in the room as to how things should be done and proceed and things of that nature, but for the most part, I think it went out very well.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Anything additional to report on?
No, that has consumed me since last Wednesday.
Thanks for all your work related to that, certainly. We'll move on to item 9A, and that's a consideration of canceling what will be our second meeting in December, which is scheduled for December 18th. If we'd like to consider canceling that meeting, we'll need a motion. Not everyone raised their hand.
Be happy to make the motion. As is traditional, I would move that we cancel our second meeting in December on December 18th, 2017, in consideration of the holidays.
I second.
Seconded by Councilor Williams. Further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign, and we will not have a second meeting in December. We'll move on to item 9B. This is a resolution that I will read on behalf of the City of Whitefish in support of our national park system. I was contacted just a few weeks ago by the Pew Charitable Trust asking to join the additional 60 cities across our country that signed on to reaffirm our commitment to restoring our national parks and providing a continual source of funding for our park facilities at the federal level. Just a couple interesting statistics that I pulled down. In 2016, over 5 million visitors enjoyed national parks in Montana, and from the Little Bighorn Battlefield to Glacier National Park, Montana saw about $548 million spent in gateway communities. That spending supported 9,467 jobs and added a cumulative benefit of $762.3 million to the state economy, money that helps businesses, schools, and of course families. Glacier Park, as an example, has a deferred maintenance estimate of about $148 million, and in 2016, about 600,000 people from out of state visited Whitefish, 83% of those visitors indicated that they came to Whitefish because they came to experience the park. So obviously a very significant driver of our local economy. So I'll read this resolution now in support of our national park system. Whereas America's national park system is a living testament to our citizens' valor, our nation's hardships, our victories, and our traditions as Americans, and has been called America's best idea. And whereas the national park system preserves the diversity, culture, and heritage of all Americans and serves as a living classroom for future generations. And whereas in 2016, the National Park Service celebrated its centennial and currently manages more than 400 nationally significant sites and an invaluable collection of more than 75,000 natural and cultural assets that span 84 million acres across all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and several U.S. territories, and insular areas. And whereas the National Park Service's mission is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And whereas in 2016, the National Park System had more than 331 million visits. And whereas in 2016, National Park Service estimates indicate that park visitors spent more than $18.4 billion at the sites and in the states and local communities adjacent to national parks. And whereas the National Park Service has the obligation to preserve our nation's history, to promote access to national parks for all citizens, stimulate revenues to sustain itself and nearby communities, educate the public about America's natural, cultural, and historical resources, and provide safe facilities and environments to enjoy these resources. And whereas in 2016, the National Park Service estimated a deferred maintenance backlog of nearly $11.3 billion, which includes repairs to aging, historical structures, trails, sewers, drainage, thousands of miles of road, bridges, tunnels, and other vital infrastructure. And whereas it is the responsibility of Congress to maintain America's national parks, to ensure our natural places and our history is preserved and documented for future generations and for the adjacent communities that rely on the direct and indirect economic benefits generated by visits to national park sites. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Whitefish City Council strongly encourages Congress to create a reliable, predictable stream of resources to address deferred maintenance needs in America's national park system. And I'll approve and adopt and sign this resolution in support of our national park system today, September 18th, 2017. That was very wordy. Thank you very much. And we'll move to councilor comments, and we'll start with Richard.
I think the only thing I have is that, it's an offshoot of my being on the Climate Action Plan, but is there any objection to printing the agenda both front and back unless there's a compelling reason not to do so? I noticed that we went to a second page just to get that number 10 adjournment. And so it could have saved us, if it's okay with everybody. I just want to make sure that there's no compelling reason not to do so, front to back. And
I think Michelle's okay with that.
Well,
I saw her nod.
It's on your list? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
That's it.
Andy.
Just a little note to the resolution we just adopted in support of our national parks. The mayor and I attended the event over in Columbia Falls, which was hosted by and chaired by John Tester, and was basically about the impact of open lands on our economies. And one of the most interesting statistics was 75% of the job growth and 75% of the income growth in the state of Montana has happened in 5 counties, obviously Flathead County being one of those, and those 5 counties all have the highest percentage of publicly owned land in them. So I think that's a pretty good indicator that these kind of lands are important to a lot of things, particularly our economy. So that's it.
Thanks, Andy. Jen.
Big thanks to city staff, city law enforcement, county law enforcement, school officials, businesses throughout the valley and all of the individuals throughout the valley for being patient through this last week as law enforcement dug into the threats at Columbia Falls, and their resolve and to be able to hold together as a community, I think, is very important. And thanks to all the additional federal agencies and assistance that we've had throughout the valley in this case, and I think we're fortunate to have you all be a part of this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Pam?
I'd just like to echo what Jen said and look forward to that continuing tomorrow when the kids go back to school.
Indeed. Thanks, Pam. Frank?
I'll pile on to some degree. I echo also what Jen said, but I think this is a demonstration of something that I think we recognize here, particularly in Whitefish, and that is, and this spreads now valley-wide, that we are a very tight-knit community. Do not attack us. Do not approach us. We don't react well. We will pull together, and it will not pull us apart. And I think that's one of the things that this kind of an attack on our community, on our children, on our way of life, demonstrates once again this community will not let stand. And so I was, again, incredibly proud of all the work that was done, the cohesiveness with which all the agencies worked together. And so I think it was a great thing. It was a great thing, another demonstration of why we live where we live.
Thank you, Frank. Katie?
I will also echo Jen's comments and just a sincere thank you to everyone who put in their double time through this stressful situation. And like Frank said, we are a very strong, close-knit community who can endure almost anything. So thank you.
Thanks, Katie. I'll echo the echo that was of the echo. But a couple things to bring up. Dave, are we planning on providing written comment to the county for their September 28th meeting?
Yeah, we went and provided a written comment to them previously, and I spoke to them. I'm going to be out of town on the 28th. I'll probably have Wendy go and find out what they're doing, but I haven't seen anything. They're supposed to provide some revised drawings, possibly. Dave DeGrampy was. He was going to contact me when those were done, and I haven't heard from him. But
are we going to have an opportunity to review their revisions and prepare a written statement?
Well, we'll look them over and see if anything's changed. Yeah, and if there's new information, then we'll comment on the new information.
Okay. Can you go ahead and send that out to the council when you receive the new information and along with your recommendations on our comment?
Okay.
I'd appreciate that. And thanks for attending, Wendy. Secondly, we're meeting, Adam, Craig, and I are meeting with the Lion Mountain Homeowners Association on, I believe, Wednesday night. And things are progressing nicely related to the wastewater issues that were identified in the Whitefish Lake Institute's study. So I'm looking forward to that meeting. For that meeting, Angie, and I think I asked Adam for this, but in case he was so busy, I'll ask Angie directly. Can we get a copy of the revised annexation, the text amendments we made to our annexation policy last year?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll email those to you.
Okay, great. If you could just email those to me, that would be great. And then in addition, some questions have arisen about the types of services that neighborhoods, receive upon annexation, and you detailed those out very well tonight with your Houston Drive staff report. Can you also send me that excerpt as well?
Yes, absolutely.
That'd be great. I'd appreciate it. Finally, I will not be here October 2nd, so Richard will be chairing the meeting. I'll be in Big Timber working, so my apologies for my absence. Anything further from staff? We are adjourned. Thanks.